Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the RELO Andes Webinar. I'm Rachel Martin. I'm an English language specialist, and I am so glad you are joining me today. This is a monthly program, so maybe you are watching this live, maybe you have found the video later on, but I'm so glad you are here. And like I said, this is the RELO Andes webinar series. If you're wondering what that means, RELO is the Regional English Language Office, and that is based out of the U.S. Embassy in Lima, Peru. And RELO Andes serves teachers throughout South America and through this webinar from around the world. So if you are here live with me, please start commenting. I can see the comments right over here. I would love to hear where you are joining me from, where you are at. If you don't already, please make sure that you like and you follow RELO Andes on Facebook. That's usually the best way to find out about our upcoming webinars, our upcoming programs. And the next webinar, just so you can mark that calendar even from the start, is going to be in April. So thank you so much for being here today. Oh, let's see. I can say hello to Mirtha from Trujillo. Let's see. I can say hello to Jose from Peru, Amer from Bosnia. Let's see, Rosa from Iquitos. Yes, keep commenting. If you are watching live, I really hope we can be very interactive. During today's webinar, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I really do want to get your feedback as we go. Hi, Edison, joining us from Quito. Great. Our topic today, we are going to be talking about student portfolios. Julie from Ayacucho, hello, hello. Oh, it's so much fun to see many of the same teachers coming back every month. Some of you I've met in person or in other RELO Andes programs. I did some classes back in February where about 45 of us were on Google Classroom all month together. So whether it's your first time or your 50th webinar, it's good to have you here. So like I said, I like to start out with questions. I want to make this interactive. So please, in the chat, I would love to hear from you if you have used portfolios before. Did you ever have to make one when you were a student, or have you assigned one as a teacher? I would really like to hear about some of your experiences there. And I can tell you, I mean, I've had to use them when I was a student or as a teacher too. I found one of my old ones. I actually brought it here to look at as I was preparing this webinar. So this was one from back when I was actually doing my teaching certificate. And, you know, it has essays in it. It has pictures of my classroom in it. It has my old lesson plans and standards checklists. Have you ever made one like this, or maybe a digital one? Yeah, let's share some of those things in the comments as we're going here. I know if you are teaching in Peru, if you were using the Aprendo en Casa materials last year, students were asked to do a portfolio. So maybe you have a little bit of experience from last year. Let's see, Karen is saying she's used them as both a student and as a teacher. Yeah, I always like to reflect back on my experiences. I mean, I think we draw a lot from when we were students ourselves. Okay, so Edison saying portfolios are kind of new in Ecuador. I think there's something that they're gaining popularity. So whether you were using them, 5 or 10 years ago, I think more and more of us will be using them in the future. All right, so keep those comments going in the chat. I want to make one distinction as I go today. I'm going to talk a lot about paper portfolios and digital portfolios as two different formats. So a lot of the things I'm going to say today apply to both of them, but I'm aware that some students are doing their entire schoolwork this year on their phones, so maybe they're doing digital ones. Other students are using scraps of paper. We can make portfolios either way. And at the end of this webinar, I'm going to talk about some ways that we can actually kind of combine the two, how we can mix the digital and the paper portfolios together. All right, so the main ideas that I want to talk about today, I have 3 main points when it comes to portfolios. What's the point of having a portfolio? Well, first of all, a portfolio exists to keep items safe. A portfolio can be accessed. It isn't something that you've put them in there for safekeeping and then they disappear forever. And hopefully, a portfolio is useful. And I want to say a portfolio needs to be useful for the students. Okay? So these are kind of my 3 ideas I want to build this little talk around. So what do I mean when I say items need to be kept safe? I mean, sometimes it's easier to think of this by thinking about the opposite. How many times has student work been lost or been damaged or become inaccessible? They couldn't get to it because it got damaged. Well, this looks different, of course, if we're talking about keeping paper safe or keeping files safe. What do I mean when I talk about keeping items in a paper portfolio safe? Do you need to use a notebook? Do you need to use a folder? Well, it could take on a lot of different forms. I think the main things you're kind of trying to prevent water damage or just damage in general. You don't want the students to have to fold or crumple their work. It weakens the paper. It's going to fall apart. A big thing when it comes to keeping them safe is making sure that the work that the students do doesn't get misplaced. Another thing to keep in mind, I put on my slide reuse or overwriting, because sometimes, you use the same paper for a lot of different assignments. You start here, you cross it out. Maybe it's the next draft you build on it. Maybe it's something totally unrelated. But if you don't have a way to think about that or track it, the original assignment gets lost because it almost gets covered over. And of course, you have to keep the items safe from other people, maybe people in the household, if there's a little brother, a little sister, a dog, a cat, a goat, whoever it is that might damage that work or might not know that they need to keep it, that the student needs to keep this for a period of time. Exactly, Yolanda. Portfolios are a great way to have students reflect on their progress. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in the 3rd point, where we talk about their usefulness. But before we can have them reflect, we need to make sure that they maintain these items, these assignments, these pieces of evidence. You can call them different things. So whether they're putting it in a folder, whether they're putting it in, a binder like the one I showed you here, they're putting it in a box, in an envelope. It needs to be something that's keeping their work physically safe. Of course, if it's a digital one, we still need to keep it safe from being accidentally deleted. Whether that's because the file gets deleted, or what if they saved it on their phone and then their phone dies. If something happens to the device, heaven forbid you spill coffee or water or something happens, I think we've probably all lost files because of technology. So how can we create a digital portfolio that keeps the files safe? Same thing there about reuse and overwriting. I always have to remind my students, save a new copy. Don't just keep working on the same draft, or I can't notice the growth because their original draft and their final draft is now the same file. I can't see progress. They can't see their own progress. So when we keep things safe or preserved, we could say preserved in the digital space, there needs to be a plan, and keeping them safe from other people. Again, intentionally or unintentionally, someone could delete the files. All right, so let's move into the second thing that a portfolio needs to do for our students. It needs to be accessible. Because when I start talking about keeping everything safe, maybe that sounds like, just putting it in a box and locking it away. That's only half the story on a portfolio. So portfolios are kind of living more than documents. They're a living collection of items. There's something that, whether it's on paper and the student goes back and actually looks at it, or it's digital and they go back and they open the files, students need to be able to go back and see what they've accumulated, what they've accomplished. So when we're talking about making it accessible for students to go back and see their own work, for paper, the key is that the students really need to know where the portfolio is. And I've been teaching teenagers, young adults, I've even taught elementary school. It's really easy to lose a portfolio. It is really easy to lose a folder. You know, you have so many things going on, but if they can't find it, they can't use it. The other part of it is that students need to remember to go back to it on a regular basis. So maybe if you are using a curriculum that builds in a project every week or every 3 weeks, once a month, that could be a regular time where the students know to go back to their portfolio and add to it or reflect on it. But if that isn't already part of your program, you might need to help them build that schedule on their own, or you might need to give them assignments from time to time where they remember to go back to the portfolio. And of course, the more frequently they visit it, that's also probably going to help them remember where they put it. Now, access when it comes to digital portfolios looks a little bit different. There's still the question of, where did I save that work? And I think the two main culprits there is when students email themselves their own work and they leave the subject line blank, or they don't put a good enough description in the subject or in the name of the file so that they can search for it later. And I know I'm super guilty of this. I will send myself a presentation or something I've been working on, and I send it so fast, I don't type a good subject line, and then it's really hard to find later. Something a lot of my students like to do, especially the teenagers, they name their files after themselves. So the file might say Anya 1, Anna Maria 1, Anna Maria 5. Well, that doesn't help them know what it was. You know, if it's called document 7, that's going to be hard to access later. Of course, the other concern with a digital portfolio is to make sure that they don't lose their passwords and that they have access to the device where it's saved, or if they've saved it in the cloud, you know, in Google Drive or on something on Wix or something like that, if they have the data to access it again. So these are factors to keep in mind as you're helping your students build their portfolios, or as you're kind of giving them a plan for their portfolios. And I know sometimes teachers get to be really hands-on in the process. You give them a checklist, or you give them detailed instructions. Other times it seems like the portfolios are more, you know, for the students. Again, with the Aprendo en Casa, I know they never had to turn those into their teachers last year, so the students were kind of doing them on their own. But as teachers, we always have a great role to play as a guide or as an advisor. We can kind of help them with this because, like it was mentioned earlier, these are maybe a new learning tool, something your students aren't used to. If they're new for you, they're definitely new for them. All right, so far we've talked about portfolios exist to keep something safe and preserved, and portfolios exist to keep those items safe and preserved so that you can come back to them. You don't just lock them away in a vault. Now we're going to talk about kind of the different types of portfolios, and I want to connect that to how portfolios are useful and how they can be useful to students. They have different purposes maybe, but I've been talking too long here without asking you a question in the comments. So thinking about both paper and digital portfolios, thinking about both of these types here, I want to ask you, what do your students think about portfolios? If you've used these before, did your students find them helpful? Did they like building them? Did they just kind of ignore them? I'd like to hear about some of your students' reactions. Yes, exactly. Monica, we just highlighted your comment there about it's very useful to organize things. You have to keep it organized. And I'm going to give you some organizational tips here in just a moment. I would really like to hear, though, about some of your students and how they have appreciated them or not. I think there's always some students who get very excited about the idea that they can personalize it. Sometimes that can also be pretty hard for students. They're waiting for you to give them exact instructions. They'll want you to tell them exactly what the outside of their portfolio needs to look like or exactly what to put into it. So sometimes, if we can encourage them to be a little bit creative. Oh, Karen, I'm so glad to hear your students like them a lot. I'm going to show you here just on the one that I did here that, let's see, if I can bring it on camera. My instructor for this many years ago asked me to personalize it. So I had put pictures of some of my classes that I had taught. I put a globe because I love to travel and that shows a country where I had lived. I put my favorite book from the program. I also put kind of a collection of languages over here. This was, my collage of things that mattered to me when I was doing this. So sometimes we can, motivate students to be involved in their own portfolios or to really take ownership of their work if they can put stuff on the cover or as part of them that are things they really like. So we have some mix of answers here. Edison's saying some of his students ignore their portfolios or don't keep everything. Others use them for final reviews and exams. And you've actually brought up something I'm going to talk about here in the next section. What should you save in the portfolios? Students sometimes wonder which things to keep, or they keep everything, or they keep very little. Let's see. Julie has a comment here about they were using digital portfolios. It looks like they were using OneDrive, and so it was a digital competence as well as the English language competence. That's fantastic. And she's also highlighted that, you can see the student's progress. If it's a digital one where they're sharing the access with you, that can be an added benefit that Wilma's also mentioning. Let's see. Martha's commenting here about the tech divide here. Some of them are working on paper, and I think paper works just fine. Of course, I think, those are the traditional portfolios. You do lose the ability to share it back and forth as easily. So some of those extra things are there. And let's take one more comment. I've got Guy here saying they don't want to use them. Teenagers prefer digital portfolios, but they can be very creative. So I guess, tapping into the interests and the age group of your students. So thank you. Keep going with the comments. I'm reading them over here as we go. I'm glad that those of you that are watching live are able to interact a little bit. And if you're watching later, I hope you're thinking of these questions and how they relate to your students as well. So in order for a portfolio to be useful to a student, it needs to have a purpose, and it needs to be organized to fit that purpose. So let's talk about some of the different purposes or some of the different reasons, the usefulness. Why are the different reasons you would keep a portfolio, or students will keep one? So a lot of times I see a list of 4 different types of portfolios discussed. There are project portfolios, there are growth portfolios, achievement portfolios, and competency portfolios. And each one of these, you organize it a little bit differently, and you're going to make different choices about what goes inside it. So let's just move through this list here. In a project portfolio, it's pretty much what the name sounds like. Students are documenting their work on a specific project. So a project portfolio should have maybe the final product. If it's something that's written or that, they can put in there, maybe it's a video, maybe it's photos if it was something they made, but it has their final product And it also shows the steps or the process that they went through to get there. So you as a teacher might give them some guidance. If it's a 3-week long project, they have to put something in their portfolio every week. Or maybe you are telling them specifically, you have to put your first draft in here. Maybe if students have a little bit more experience with portfolios, they can choose those items themselves, of course. But a project portfolio, it's pretty limited in a time limit. It's one specific project, and you're documenting it. It can definitely include self-reflection and growth, and you could put their final grades in it if that was helpful, but it's all centered around that activity. A growth portfolio, it really is about showing development over time. So a growth portfolio, something that's pretty unique or distinctive about this type of portfolio, is that it almost always includes self-reflection from the student. So they're going to put evidence in there of things they were doing, whether that is, some of their work maybe graded with a rubric, or it could be their rough drafts, their final drafts, it could be pictures. But accompanying those, they are going to write, they're going to self-reflect, and they're going to comment on their own growth. This is fantastic for online learning or for hybrid learning, because we need our students to take a lot of responsibility and be very self-directed. This can help them see that direction that they're traveling in. So a growth portfolio is also, just like the project portfolio, it is limited by time, because you have to, pick, we're going to show growth for this month, for these 6 months. Maybe it's for the entire school year. So it's a longer period of time, but it's still, the limits on it are really set by when you start and when you end. You should have evidence. The student should include things from early on, from in the middle, and from the end of the project. So you really have the documentation, the evidence, the items, and their thoughts on it. That's a growth portfolio. Then we have an achievement portfolio. And I think that this is the one that students think they're making all the time. So an achievement portfolio, I've seen these done like at the end of a school year sometimes, or when students are transitioning from one level of education to the next. They put in an achievement portfolio, you put all of your best work from that moment. So the student is really showing, here I am, here's the very best of everything I can do. And there's an emphasis on the final products more than the process. And there can be great moments, there can be reasons to use these, but it's just a snapshot. And I always want to be clear with my students if they're doing this type of portfolio, because like I said, I think students think most of the time, students want to always put just their very, very best work into the portfolio. But a lot of times I actually want them to put their work that shows how they're progressing. So achievement portfolios exist, but I don't use them a whole lot. I tend more toward the growth portfolios myself. The fourth type of portfolio that I want to mention, and I see a great question over here in the comments, but I'm going to get to that in a moment here. We'll come back to that in a bit. The competency portfolios, these are when the student needs to demonstrate that they've met a certain level. So these can really be used as a form of assessment, even as a final assessment. These often include a rubric or checklists. The one that I showed you, I know I keep coming back to my example, but this was a competency portfolio. In this class, I had to demonstrate that I had done all of these different things. So I had to include specific evidence to show that I was there. Competency portfolios can be a great way to do assessment because they're often more holistic, they're more authentic than just giving a test. So these are definitely worth exploring. But again, they're different than a growth portfolio that's just showing growth over time. So make sure you are really clear when you ask your students to make a portfolio, and make sure they are really clear so that they know what needs to go in there and what the purpose is. Of course, you can create a portfolio, or maybe your program asks you to do a portfolio that mixes or merges or has a different purpose. There's hybrid portfolios that combine different objectives. I've heard of these. I haven't done one, but I want to try one of these celebration portfolios sometimes. Those are often used where students get to choose what they want to put in there. So sometimes it's like at the end of the year, they get to pick what do they want to celebrate? What do they want to showcase to their families or to their teachers? So that could be another fun type of portfolio to play with. So I want to take a couple of these questions that I've seen over here. So the question here, what's the difference between a portfolio, a pinnacle, or a diary? Okay, so for me, a portfolio is a collection of student work, whether it is digital or whether it is paper, whether it's physical or digital, that includes evidence to support something over time. So whether it's evidence to support growth, evidence to support achievement, evidence to support they've met a certain level of mastery. But to me, a portfolio is where you have these documentation, these evidences, these samples, and you put them together. You don't put every single thing that a student does in there. Sometimes, students will keep a notebook or something in class, a daily calendar where they're gluing every single thing in there. In a portfolio, you pick and choose. Usually it's the student. The student picks and chooses. So certain items are selected because they represent certain points in their achievements or their development. So you selectively include evidence, and often it includes an element of self-reflection as well. So to me, that is what a portfolio is. I would define those other two things slightly differently. A diary for me probably wouldn't include all the evidence, but I know teachers or programs might use those terms a little bit differently. There was also a question here about what age is appropriate to use portfolios. So I've been really lucky in my career. I have taught English language learners who were as young as 4 years old and as old as, adults in a language center setting. And I've used them with kindergartners. I've used them with very young children. In that case, they are making fewer decisions. They're maybe less involved in selecting based on criteria, but you can help them put stuff in there, help them understand, we're going to save this and we're going to look at it later. Even young children notice when they improve, especially if you bring their attention to it. So adapt the assignment, but I would use portfolios if the student is able to talk to you about their work, even in a basic way. Use portfolios, it'll work well. Okay, so let's keep going here. As I was saying, for it to be useful to the student, there's two dimensions. It has to have a purpose, and we've talked about some of those here. I love them seeing in the comments people are thinking about portfolios they have used. It also needs to be organized to fit that purpose. Someone mentioned very early on in the chat about the importance of organization, and it needs to be organized. So general thoughts, make sure you include the title of the assignment or a relevant title on each piece of evidence. This goes back to sometimes naming the files. Like I was saying, if they're doing a digital portfolio, make sure the file names make sense, that you can go back and see them later, that you can search for them. If you're doing a physical paper one, write on the top of the paper in really bold, clear lettering, or on the back if if it's something very visual and you don't want to mess it up. But make sure you have the title and the date of the assignment. If you're working with the Aprendo en Casa materials in Peru, there's going to be, I think there's 9 different assignments over the course of the year that are recommended, that are required to be saved into a portfolio. Well, 9 over a school year, students may mix those up, or they may forget exactly when they do them. I know if you're working with some other programs, I've seen students need to save something once a month. Just have them put the date on there. It'll save so much hardship later, especially when they need to go back and compare. Okay, well, if I did this in April and this in June and I can see a difference, it's a lot easier to talk about. Now, I've hinted at this a little bit. I've mentioned it as we've been going, but I want to ask you. So if you want to jump into the chat again, what type of evidence, what sort of items can go into a portfolio that you then need to organize? We need to talk about what's actually in here. So please share in the chat what could go into a portfolio that makes it meaningful, that's really representative. So, of course, we've been mentioning rough drafts. Final products can go in there. Oh, Edison's saying organized by skill. Exactly. There's kind of, two choices there. You can organize chronologically or you can organize by theme, and it depends on the purpose of your portfolio. You were mentioning competency ones. I would definitely do a competency one by skill. Let's see. You can include videos. If students made videos, they could maybe record them with their phone. If they are able to record an audio files can be part of a portfolio, especially a digital one, of course. Martha's saying, in the Aprendo en Casa program, you put the challenge, the DIY goes in there, perfect. Rubrics, self-evaluations, even grades from the teacher, not necessarily like the number grade, but if there was feedback, meaningful feedback, or peer feedback, that can go into a portfolio if you're showing how they developed and improved a project over time. And be creative. Think about, how could students do a slideshow? Maybe they make a little slideshow or a presentation or a meme on their phone. If something like that is showing a language competency, that can go in their portfolio as well. It doesn't always have to be an essay or something very dry and academic. Portfolios can be fun because you can include a lot of multimedia. So these are questions you have to ask yourself before you assign your portfolio based on what type it is. Is it, if it's a project portfolio, if it's an achievement, if it's growth, if it's competency, what type of evidence goes in there? Should they include self-reflection? Should they include feedback from others? It really depends on what you're trying to do with this portfolio. If you're organizing a paper portfolio, my top advice is to make sure that the headings, that's the date, the title, it's bold, it's easy to read. Color code it if you can, even if it's just using a marker or something. Make it visually interesting and maybe encourage students to be creative about that. Encourage them to create their own system. Not everyone needs to highlight it in blue, but they should find something to highlight it in. And like Edison mentioned before, he was talking about organizing by skill. You could organize by skill, by theme, or in the case of a growth portfolio, especially, you want to go chronologically, usually. Yeah, thank you, Wilma. Those are different stages in a project. You would want to have all of those in a project portfolio, definitely. If you're organizing a digital portfolio, folders are your best friend. Encourage your students to make folders the same way they might make sections in a paper one. Make sure those folders are meaningful, that they're well labeled. I know a lot of teachers are teaching through WhatsApp right now, and for some students, it's an option to also access Google Drive. So the teachers have set up folders on Google Drive, and then they send the students the links directly through WhatsApp. Of course, that does require a data connection, but Google Drive, or I think Julie might have mentioned OneDrive earlier, is another equivalent. I love using those for portfolios with my students. Of course, not every folder is a portfolio. Some of those are just work folders because they're putting all of their daily work in there. Remember, a portfolio is curated. You make choices. Not everything goes in it. You can also save photos and organize photos into folders. So this does not require an internet connection. And in fact, I want to highlight this as a way to kind of bridge in between paper and digital. So if you have a student who is doing their work on paper, but they are concerned they won't be able to keep that safe, if they put it in a folder, it's going to get lost, it's going to get crumpled, it's not going to be accessible. They can take a picture of it and save those pictures in a folder, make a designated portfolio folder on their phone. So the work was paper, but the preservation becomes digital. And as long as they have access to that device, they can go back to it in a month or 3 months or 6 months and then reflect on it. This, I think, will be very helpful for a lot of students doing the Aprendo en Casa portfolios this year as a way to digitize without data, but just digitize on a local device. Another way to kind of bridge that paper and digital world, and this is one to remember when we are all back in person. This is something to use with hybrid classes, with digital, with in-person classes, QR codes. If you've never used a QR code, they look like this. And a QR code is a visual link. So with this is actually a link. If any of you are watching this, especially later, if you want to pause me and access this code, it's going to take you to a handout that isn't mine, but that's from another teacher who's described how she uses QR codes. And I really like her handout there. But how you use one of these visual links is you take a phone, and this works with any Android phone that's an 8 or a 9. It can do it directly from the camera. If it's earlier than that, if it's an Android 7 or before, you need an app. But the camera will recognize that this is a QR code. And it's kind of hard to see on my screen here, but it actually highlighted it. There's little yellow brackets around it because it recognized that this is a QR code. And so then it opens the option, automatically it pops up, do you want to open this link? And all you have to do is tap on it. So this is a way that I use with my classes to share information when I want them to go to a website. This is often a great way to do it. But in terms of portfolios, this gives students the option they could record an audio clip of them talking, save it on Google Drive, and then put this link into a paper portfolio. It's another way to bridge that gap. QR codes are interesting if you're not already using them. So that pretty much brings us to the end of this webinar. I want to open it up for questions here. So if you have questions and you're watching live, go ahead and put that in the comments. And just remember, these were kind of our 3 main ideas, our 3 main, well, at this point, we're going to make them instructions about portfolios. Portfolio, you need to keep the items in the portfolio safe. You need to make a plan for the student to revisit the portfolio. And you need to organize the portfolio so that it's useful. That comes from whatever its purpose is. You're choosy. You're not putting everything in there. You're choosy, but you're making it useful by having it organized and working toward a goal, working toward a purpose for your students. If you want to talk more about this, I would love to see you tomorrow. We are going to hold a discussion group like we do just about every month, the day after the webinar. The information to sign up is going to be going on the RELO Andes Facebook page. So head over there and sign up for the discussion group tomorrow if you want to chat more about portfolios. I would love to hear how you've used them before, what went well, what your challenges were. I can tell you more stories about when I've used them in class. It looks like we are good to go here. So thank you, everyone. I will see you next month at the next RELO Andes webinar. I'm Rachel Martin. Take care, everyone.